All right, well, on today's program, we are going to take one more chance to talk about the subject of faith. And to do that, we're going to look at a passage in Mark chapter 5, dealing with the faith of the woman who had the bleeding problem. Again, it's going to be in Mark chapter 5 is going to be our text. And then after that, the next episode following that, we're going to get back into the book of Revelation. So if you've been chomping at the bit and looking forward to getting back into that study, that will come next time. But I wanted to just kind of highlight one more example of faith, a good example of faith that we see here in the Gospels. And like I said before, this is something, when we first took this break from the book of Revelation, the whole thing of faith and talking about faith, it being a theme at first was accidental. I just kind of stumbled upon it. Says, hey, we've spent a couple of times talking about faith in different facets. And so last time and then this time we're just kind of, continuing on in that, on that theme of faith. And I think it's good because we've gotten a good look at what great faith looks like. Aside from our examination of James chapter 2, we were talking about whether, what's the whole deal with faith and works. A time before that, when we looked at the Canaanite woman, last week when we looked at the centurion, I think both of those accounts in the Gospels really shows us some good pictures of what good faith looks like. And so we're going to do the same thing today on this program. Again, dealing with the woman with the bleeding problem. Again, from Mark chapter 5, we're drawing mainly from that text, and we're going to read that text there in a minute. But that's what's in store. So I hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right, so here's the scoop, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe you can tell, and maybe you can't. If you can't, I think that's great. If you can't tell, but you might be able to tell from the sound of my voice that I don't sound normal. That's because I'm sick. Again, if you remember, I was sick like a couple months ago, and I remember we were going through Revelation chapter 11 at that time, and I think that I sounded like death during that episode when I was recording that. So a couple months later, I'm sick again, having to go through this whole thing. I think though, I think that I sound better now than when I was sick a couple months ago when I was doing this podcast. That's the good news of it. But man, that usually doesn't happen, where I get sick within that close amount of time. So, but I just like last time though, this time I'm kind of on an upswing. I think this time has kind of been a little bit more weird for me because there have been moments, and this has been going on for like a week now. I've been sick for about a week, but there have been times within that week where I feel like, okay, I'm on the upswing. Tomorrow, after a good night's sleep, I should feel okay. But in the middle of the day, I'll be like, oh man, I feel awful. I feel awful. And then like later on that night or that evening, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm bouncing back. I'm feeling better. So it's kind of been a roller coaster. So I'm feeling okay now, but I'm wondering if I'm going to feel a lot worse later on this evening. I hope and pray that I don't, because I just want this to be over. Like I said, I kind of been sick for almost a week. So, but anyway, even with that, a lot to be thankful to God for, just with all the pain and heartache and trauma and all the things that are out there, that people are having to suffer, a cold, isn't that big of a deal. So, anyway, yeah. Before we get into our text, one more thing, and I think most of you who are faithful listeners know what's coming. Shameless plug time, right? My book, Signs of the End, got to mention it again. What did Jesus say about his own return and the events that point to it? Available on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. You can also purchase that electronically on Kindle if you wish. It's a book that covers Jesus's words on the Olivet Discourse. I strongly recommend that you pick up this book. And I've been encouraged just from, just some people here and there. I'm not getting showers of comments or anything like that. I'm just saying, like, just with people who've just kind of talked to me personally, and people who've read the book, who speak very highly of it and say that this was very well written and that it's answered some questions for them. And it's really helped them out a lot. That really means a lot to me to hear that sort of feedback. And so hopefully that's a nudge for you, if you haven't ordered the book yet, to go ahead and order yourself a copy. Really, if you've been listening for a while and you've heard all of these plugs that I've been making for my book and you haven't ordered it already, I don't know what else to tell you. I feel like I remember weeks ago I said, if you haven't ordered the book, I might have to send you a strongly worded email. Now I think if at this point, if you haven't ordered the book, I think me and you need to sit down and have a very serious conversation and get down to the bottom of why you haven't ordered the book yet. If this is your first time or your second time or something listening to Loving the Scriptures, I can excuse you this time. But that excuse can only go so far. I can't even be intimidating with a straight face. So everybody should do what they want. But I would thoroughly encourage you pick up a copy of my book online. And I always push online, but go to any brick and mortar store, Christian bookstore, if you have one in your area. They might have a copy, and if they don't, you can order one from them too. That's also an option as well. So yeah, but I don't care how you do it. Just pick up a copy of the book and be blessed. I want that attached to everything as well. I want you to order the book, and when you read the book, I hope that you're blessed by it. So I want to attach that to the encouragement as well. Okay, so Mark chapter 5 is where we are, and I'm going to read the passage here. This is kind of an interesting situation because we kind of have two stories going on at once, and I guess you can kind of call it a kind of a sandwich of a situation, because you have a situation going on with a man named Jairus, and then you have this situation with the woman with the bleeding problem. That kind of interrupts things, and we'll talk about that a little bit later here in the program. And then we get back to Jairus and his whole problem with his dying and then dead daughter. We're gonna only kind of highlight just maybe the first two aspects of that. The goal of this isn't to look at the whole thing. I really want to focus on the woman. We could very easily look at the whole thing and see what happens with Jairus' daughter. I can just tell you right now, spoiler alert, Jesus raises Jairus' daughter from the dead. That's not to say that that's all that you can draw from that. I don't want to make that sound simplistic or anything. But I really want to focus on this woman here, because what is going on with her and just the circumstance that she is in at that moment, and what drives her to seek out Jesus, and not even only to confront him, but just to touch his garments, and with the belief that she'd be healed. I want to talk about that and go through that and just kind of see what we can draw from that. So let me read the text here in Mark chapter 5, and it's verses 21 through 34 is the area of emphasis here. This is what it says. It says, "And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, 'My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live.' And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Okay, so that's what we're dealing with there. And I think the beginning portion of what we learn about what's going on with Jairus here is a pretty important thing as a lead into this kind of I don't know if you call it a B story, that's kind of attached to this whole thing regarding this woman with the bleeding problem. But as we see here, Jesus has come to the other side of the lake. We're talking about the Sea of Galilee here. He's traveled by boat. He comes to the shore, and as per usual, he's greeted by a great crowd of people. Obviously by this time, reports about Jesus has spread to so many people. They're aware of what he's able to do. Some people are maybe drawn to his teachings, all sorts of things. We even see this in earlier accounts in this same book, in the book of Mark. His fame is really growing, and it has been growing. And so when he arrives by boat on the other side of the lake, as it says there in verse 21, it says, "A great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea." So that's kind of, we're encountering something here that's by this time in Mark we're kind of seeing is pretty normal. This is pretty standard. And in fact, in a few other areas, you read about Jesus drawing away to remote places so that nobody would find him. That sort of thing. So you kind of get an understanding, just reading through other earlier sections in Mark, just what Jesus had to go through as far as dealing with the crowds. Now, I don't think that Jesus was anti-crowd or didn't like the crowds. He had, purposes for drawing away to remote places and not wanting to be found at certain times. But you also see him, I want to say in Matthew chapter 9, when large crowds are gathering around him, it says that he had compassion on them, and we're gonna get a look at this compassion from Jesus as well. And I think that's important to point out because, while we're focusing on what great faith looks like and how it's displayed from this woman, I think we can't detach what we learn from that and detach that from things that we can learn about Jesus himself and just the display of grace and compassion that comes from him. In this whole thing, we've seen it even before. We saw it last time, and then it's dealing with the centurion, and everything like that. So let's also pay attention to that, the compassion that Jesus has, that's extended to this woman, and quite honestly and quite frankly to Jairus as well. He's also a recipient of this whole thing as well. But so a great crowd has come to him. Once he gets to the other side. And so in verse 22, it says, Then came one of the synagogue rulers, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. Okay. So the one thing I think that's important for us to recognize about this guy, and we're given the name here, Jairus, is that he is I think one of the big main points that we see here is that he is a ruler. He's one of the rulers of the synagogue. Okay, and rulers of the synagogue, they had administrative roles within the synagogues in their area, And these positions, a ruler of a synagogue was not that position, I guess, if you want to call it a position, wasn't just given to anybody. I mean, it wasn't given to your normal average person normally. Somebody who was a ruler of the synagogue was really usually somebody of standing. And I suppose if they did give that position to anybody, that holding that position would make them somebody of a person of standing, I guess you could say as well. But I mean, whatever the case, here you have this guy who's not just an average person. He's a ruler of the synagogue, and that gives you an idea that this is a somebody. This is a VIP within the culture of the Israelite people during that time. This guy was a somebody. He was a VIP. He was a very important person. So given that, though, it's very significant and it's very interesting to notice and to observe that this quote unquote somebody. And, I say that because, just so that we're clear that Jesus doesn't agree to help his daughter because of his social status. And we're going to see that in his dealing with the woman. But it's interesting that this person in Jewish culture, who would have been seen as a somebody and somebody who would have had significant standing within the community, takes the position that he does towards Jesus. Because as it says there, he says, seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly. And given the request, it's understandable. I mean, this guy is really desperate because the life of his little girl, his little daughter, is at stake here. And I think that, taking the lower position, kneeling down before him, is it's a sign of homage and respect. And I think even more so, I think a lot of people that we see in the Gospels, who are people, men and women of great faith, are people who understood who Jesus was, that he was more than just a human being. And whatever the case, at the very least, this synagogue ruler had an idea that Jesus was some special somebody, a greater somebody than him. And he demonstrates that by falling down before Jesus at his feet. He fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death." So understand this. She's at the point of death. So really you can say, very clearly that there's no time to waste. There's no time to lose. And the fact that he's earnestly imploring Jesus, you can get the sense that he's saying, please, please, you have to come quickly. Please, my daughter is at the point of death. Now listen to what he goes on to say, where it says, come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. So this was, obviously we know that this is somebody who is familiar with what Jesus is able to do. Maybe he's witnessed a miracle or two. If not that, he's heard obviously about his miracles and how he's able to heal the sick and the things that he's able to do with that. And so he comes desperately, though I would say confidently, to Jesus, asking and imploring rather earnestly for him to come and heal his daughter. And so in verse 24, beginning of verse 24, it says, "And he went with him." So here, and by the way, here's an example of Jesus going and following this guy, and he's about to go into this person's house to perform this miracle, which is different than what we saw last time with the centurion, who said, "I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof." And remember, I told you, I don't think that that's necessarily having to do with the centurion thinking, "I don't want you to become ceremonially unclean because you'll be coming into the house of a Gentile." I think it goes deeper than that, because the centurion understood who he was in comparison to who Jesus was. And he says, "I am not worthy to have you under my roof." And so, he's saying, just, I know that from afar, from a distance, you can do the healing and that sort of thing. Remember what I said last time, though. I said last time that doesn't necessarily mean that anybody in the same position or in a similar situation who asked Jesus to heal and then Jesus comes to heal them, that they would be in the wrong if they allowed Jesus to come into their house, as if it's less reverent. Okay. We're just dealing with the difference of what's going on in a person's heart at that particular moment. Not saying necessarily that one is better than the other. I think both with the centurion and with this synagogue ruler here, we're dealing with people who have faith in who Jesus is and what he's able to do in their situation. Both, by the way, having to do with interceding on behalf of somebody else, on behalf of somebody who they care deeply about. The centurion, the centurion servant meant a lot to the centurion. Here, obviously, with Jairus, it says daughter, so you get the understanding that yes, the daughter means a lot to this man. But here Jesus is going with Jairus, and Jairus isn't saying, "Hey, don't come under my roof" or anything. But that's okay. Okay, one is not better than the other. One is not wrong, and the other is not is right. Just to point that out. But Jesus is on his way. He's en route now. Obviously, we see this, and the crowd. The crowd is gathered around him, and as the crowd gathered around him, Jairus comes up. So the crowd has witnessed this whole thing. You get a sense that they know what's going on, okay, and that they know where Jesus is headed and what's going on, what the situation is. So they're all following Jesus to Jairus's house. Okay, so in the middle of verse 24, it says, "And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him." And in other words, it's just saying that they were really pressing in against him. And again, I don't think this is anything that's unusual. I don't think that this is anything that we should be caught by surprise by. I mean, again, like I said, Jesus's fame has spread like nothing else. And so people are around him, and the crowd is so great that he's really closed in. He and his disciples are boxed in by this great crowd. Now, that's an important detail, obviously, given what we're going to see happen with this woman. Verse 25, it says, "And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse." Okay, so here's one thing. I don't know if this woman was originally part of the crowd to begin with, or if she heard that Jesus was in the area, caught up with the crowd, and then pushed her way through the crowd or whatever. I'm thinking maybe the latter, given her condition and what she was going through as far as her bleeding problem. But there you see in that verse there, in verses 25 and 26, the whole condition with what this woman had to deal with, and it is quite a condition. Okay, and let's just kind of notice just the descriptions here, because the descriptions here are really telling. And it gives us an understanding of the plight that this woman had to go through. Okay. Now, the first thing that we understand here in verse 25, it says that there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. Now, to understand what life was like for this woman as somebody who had this hemorrhaging problem, I mean, that's basically what it is. That's basically what you're dealing with here. We would be good to go back to the Old Testament and look at Leviticus chapter 15. Leviticus, the one book that people find hard to stomach, not because there's disgusting things in there or anything, but with the stuff that's in there doesn't hold a lot of people's interest. But I mean, there are things in here that are important to understand as it relates to understanding things in the New Testament, the things in the Gospels, and just even theology and doctrine that's laid out in the New Testament as well. And to understand what this woman had to go through with her bleeding, you can look at Leviticus chapter 15. Now, verses 19 through 24 kind of gives regulations regarding a woman who's having her period. And, the whole thing of dealing with that uncleanness, she's going to be unclean. This is how you deal with it. What she touches is unclean. People who touch her is unclean. Everything that she sits on is unclean, and everything like that. But this isn't a menstrual situation that we're dealing with here with this woman. Now, what she is dealing with, this woman who's having this hemorrhaging, is that sort of condition is addressed in the Bible too. And it's here in Leviticus chapter 15. In the next section there in that chapter, in verses 25 and following. Now listen to this. So here's the regulation here. It says if a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual impurity. So there's the distinction there. This is not part of her menstruation. This is a different kind of bleeding that she has to deal with here. Not at the time of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, all the days of the discharge she shall continue in uncleanness. Now let me just pause right there and draw your attention back to Mark chapter 5. Remember what it said there in verse 25, and there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. Now, 12 years is a long time. So 12 years is how she's had to struggle with this. Now, I don't know if we should look at this as something where he's saying that for 12 years, nonstop, she's just bleeding and bleeding and bleeding. I tend to doubt that that's how it worked. But I think what we're supposed to gather from this is that in the span of 12 years, she is very frequently dealing with this whole thing of bleeding in her body and hemorrhaging in her body. And so she's bleeding pretty regularly. Again, so you take that and you see that she's dealing with this for 12 years. And then again, when you look at Leviticus chapter 15, it says, all the days of the discharge she shall continue in uncleanness. So all this to say is that she's labeled as unclean for a very long time, for pretty much most, if not all, of the 12 years that she's had to struggle with this. Okay. And even if I guess you can imagine that if within that time frame and all the time that she's struggling with this, if she goes through the regulations that are laid out in Leviticus 15, as far as it relates to cleanness, as soon as she finishes that, she might have another bleeding problem, a bleeding episode right soon after that, and she's got to go through the whole thing all over again. The point being, I don't think we're dealing with somebody where she has a bleeding episode, she goes through all the cleansing, and then 5 months later it happens again and that sort of thing. I think the impression that we're supposed to get is that this is so much part of her life in those 12 years that it's unbearable. Okay. So all the days of the discharge she shall continue in uncleanness. As in the days of her impurity she shall be unclean. Every bed on which she lies all the days of her discharge shall be to her as the bed of her impurity. And everything on which she sits shall be unclean, as in the uncleanness of her menstrual period. So in other words, it's saying it's the same rules as if she was having her menstruation. Not saying that she's going through her menstruation, but it's just saying that the rules of uncleanness are the same here as if she was going through her menstrual impurity. Verse 27, and whoever touches these things shall be unclean. So this has the potential of affecting other people. It'd be one thing if this was just for you, but I mean, if you sit down on something, you touch on something and that becomes unclean, and then somebody else touches you or touches what you touch and they become unclean, now you're starting to deal with things that, it starts to affect your social life, or your family life, or whatever your situation is as it relates to other people. It says, and whoever touches these things shall be unclean and shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. So other people, if they're caught in uncleanness because of her uncleanness, they have to go through a ritual to make themselves clean. Now, I know if I was in this position, if I was in this in any woman's position, having to go through this, I would be so nervous that people would get mad at me if, because of me, they became unclean and they had to go through the inconvenience of having to wash and do all of this stuff, because it's because of me that they're unclean. Okay. Assuming that, maybe, somebody's just disregarding what God says and they touch something and then they say, normally I would think that I'm to blame for somebody else's uncleanness. Maybe I shouldn't think that if I were in that situation, but that's how I would feel. Verse 28, but if she is cleansed of her discharge, she shall count for herself 7 days, and after that she shall be clean. And on the 8th day she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons and bring them to the priest to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and the priest shall use one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. And the priest shall make atonement for her before the Lord for her unclean discharge. her unclean discharge. That's what it's labeled here. I mean, and again, listen, and this is something that anybody in this position or the woman here in Mark chapter 5, they can't help this. They can't help that they have this condition about them, okay? But this is the regulation. This is the rule. And the person in that situation has an unclean discharge. So that's what this woman has right now. She has been battling with this for 12 years. No doubt this has affected how she relates to people socially. I can only imagine, just being very careful with things around her. It's like, did you touch that? Did you sit on that? Just kind of, because you can't sit on what she sat on, because if you do, then you'll be unclean, and then you have to wash your clothes, and you'll be unclean until evening and everything like that. So back in Mark chapter 5, so there's that whole thing there. Just kind of explain, when you're dealing with this woman that has a discharge of blood, and she's been dealing with this for 12 years, you kind of have a greater sense of things now that you have the law background behind it. And not only that, though, but in verse 26, it says, and who had suffered much under many physicians. So she's gone to all the experts that she can. Okay. She's gone to all the experts, and obviously nothing had helped. And not only has she's gone to many physicians, and obviously not helping, but it also says there, and had spent all that she had. So she's now out of resources. And she's still in the same, well, actually, no, she's not in the same condition. I take that back, because as it says there, at the end of verse 26, it says, and was no better, but rather grew worse. So there was a change in condition. It was just in the wrong direction. Okay. Now it's interesting. And if you've heard messages on this account in the Gospels, and you're probably not new to this whole thing, that I'm about to say, but it's very interesting. In case you don't know, I just want to mention it because it's interesting that in Luke's account, and we know that Luke was a physician, that whole thing of suffering under the hand of, going to many physicians and spending all that she had, and where it says that she didn't get any better, but she grew worse. That's not in Luke's account. I think that detail might have shown up in Lucan manuscripts that were maybe written later, that coming from scribes and copyists who were familiar with parallel passages that might have put that in. But in earlier manuscripts of the book of Luke, which is probably more reflective of what was in the original or what was not in the original. What's not in the original of that whole thing of her going to many physicians or suffering under the hands of many physicians and growing worse and that sort of thing. So apparently Luke didn't want to give his profession a bad name, I suppose. So that's her condition. It seems like a pretty hopeless condition here. And you're out of options, it seems like. You've seen all the people that you can, it seems like. She's seen many physicians. And even with their limited knowledge, and when we're talking about physicians, let's be real here. They might have had some knowledge of how things work with the body, but the medical knowledge of things having to do with the body and healing and stuff was nowhere near what we're used to right now. Doesn't mean that doctors didn't or hardly ever helped back then. They were a help. They were the best that they had at that time. But even then, their knowledge of things was limited. So even with their limited knowledge and the many physicians that this woman saw, there was nothing that they could do. She was out of resources now. She spent all that she had. And to top it all off, she didn't get any. I mean, at the very least, we would say, okay, if her condition is still there, we would hope, okay, maybe she's just the same now. She might not be better, but she's just the same. No, it's not even the fact that she's the same, that her condition has grown worse. So I would imagine that for a woman like this, there's a certain level of desperation that we're dealing with there. You would imagine anyway. So going into verse 27 here, back in Mark chapter 5, it says, she had heard the reports about Jesus, and that's nothing new. I mean, that's why you had the crowds all around Jesus. They'd either seen or heard about him and what he was all about and what he was doing, and it called attention to him. Same thing with this woman here. She'd heard about Jesus. She had heard of the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. Okay. That was her plan. And this is her thinking. We get into her motivation here in verse 28. It says, "For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well." Okay. Now, this isn't a matter of superstition. I think if we're dealing with somebody who has heard about what Jesus has done, she has certainty here of what he's able to do. And so confidently, or somewhat confidently, she goes and she goes to Jesus to get this healing. Now, there's no confrontation that happens here initially. The woman realizes that she can't do that because the crowd is very imposing. He's surrounded by, and everything. And so, that's kind of, what you have here. Now, one might be tempted to think here, just this woman coming into this situation, that what we're dealing with here, given everything that she's gone through, that what we're dealing with here is a woman who is just this is her last resort. And this is why she's really doing this. Everything else has failed. Well, I got to try something, so I'll just try this. And kind of thinking that that's maybe what was on her mind, having heard the reports about Jesus. But I don't think that that's what we're dealing with. This isn't something where she says, well, I'm just going to try this. Nothing else has worked. So, I think that what we're dealing with here is a woman who has a real sense of hope. She has a great deal of hope with what's going on here. And the fact that Jesus, after hearing the reports about him, and now he's in the area. Okay. She has certainty. This is what's going to happen. If I can get to him, I can be healed. Now, again, like I said, there isn't a confrontation like there was with Jairus, where she says, hey, can you heal me real quick? And that sort of thing. But she understands, and like I said, she couldn't do that anyway because of the crowd. The crowd was the barrier in her way anyway. So she comes up behind him in the crowd. Now underline that term in your mind, in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. So confrontation is pretty much impossible. A face-to-face request, it's not going to happen. Does that stop the woman? No. And let me tell you something very interesting here. Let me tell you what else doesn't stop the woman. What also doesn't stop the woman is the fact that by her being in the crowd, she is making so many other people around her unclean, right? Because didn't we just read in Leviticus Chapter 15 what happens when people touch her, or things that she touched, or when they sit on things that she sat on, and that sort of thing. They become ceremonially unclean. Now, if there's any sort of hesitation, I would imagine that would be a big one there. I don't want to be the cause of other people's uncleanness, but yet that is what she has to do in order to get to Jesus, and do the very least that she can do in this situation is come up behind him, reach out, and just touch his garment. I think it's one of the other parallels where it says it touches the fringe of his garments, I believe is one of the parallels says. In order for that, the only possible thing in that situation for her to do, in order for that to take place, she has to go into the crowd. She has to touch other people in order to push through the people in the crowd, thus making the people that she comes into physical contact with unclean. Now, if, you can imagine if somebody's bumped into by a woman who's pushing her way through the crowd, and then they see that she's bleeding, or she has a bleeding problem, you'd be like, hey, lady, what gives? You know what I have to do? Now I'm ceremonially unclean. Thanks a lot, lady. Thanks a lot. But I don't think that that's what the woman is thinking about right now. She's in a desperate situation. And in that desperate situation, her one and only hope, the one thing that she knows, where she knows she can get healing from, is passing by her, and she has to get to him. Because she knows that if she touches his garments, she will be made well. And that was the confidence that she had. That's what was going on in her mind. If I touch even his garments, I will be made well. Not, I might be made well. There's a good possibility that I might be made, that I could be made well. There's no uncertainty there. It's like the centurion that we saw last time. So here, there's certainty. There's certainty that if I do this, I will be healed. Okay? So even when the regular options are closed to her, she's like, that's okay. I understand who I'm dealing with. So I'm okay with the bare minimum of the very least of what I can do, and just touch his garments. That was the level of her faith, and the crowd did not stop her, because she had certainty of what would be able to happen in her mind would be her non-encounter. Okay, so she reaches out, touches the garments, the garment of Jesus, all the while making everybody else unclean. Now, in verse 29, it says, and immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Notice the word immediately there. Okay, this wasn't something that was progressive. This wasn't anything that was gradual. This was something that happened immediately, and this was something that she felt in her body. Now, it's very interesting that both her and Jesus knew that something was up after this whole transaction, I guess you could say, took place, because the woman immediately felt in her body that the flow of blood had dried up, and that she had been healed of her disease. Okay, and by healed of her disease, it's like, I mean, it's knocked out, it's gone, never to come back. You know, if we're dealing with somebody who's dealing with frequent episodes of bleeding, we're not talking about, it's done for now until the next time. This isn't a temporary fix that she was looking for. She was looking for a permanent one, and she got it, and she felt it in her body, that she had been healed of her disease. That's what she felt. Now in verse 30, Jesus, it says, and Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? Now, it's interesting that, there's a level of, you have this whole thing where he says, who touched my garments? Now, the way that Jesus knows that something happens is, as that verse says, he perceived that power had gone out from him. Now, it's interesting that he equates the power going out from him, and what he attaches to that is that somebody touched my garments. Not just a matter of a simple touch, but he's saying somebody touched my garments with the hope and the certainty that they would be healed. That's what. So it's interesting. So he not only perceives that power had gone out from him, but he had perceived that somebody had done the best that they could do with the limited, opportunity that they have to touch him, and by that touching of his garments that they would be made well. He knew the avenue that whoever touched his garments, that was an avenue that somebody chose to do in order for power to come out of him. Okay. So it's just, I just find that that's very interesting. So Jesus knows that something happened. The woman knows that something happened. Jesus, and again, in the description in verse 30 about Jesus perceiving these things, it says that he immediately perceived that something was up. Now, the question here, he says, who touched my garments? Verse 31, and his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, and you say, who touched me? And, you can see where the disciples are coming from. It does, from a very human perspective, seem like a very odd question. They don't know that power has gone out from Jesus, right? And they have no way of knowing what this woman is thinking and what her whole plan is in touching Jesus's garment. So they're totally clueless. So as they're going about in the crowd, and then all of a sudden Jesus turns around and says, who touched my garments? It's like, a lot of people are touching your garments, Jesus. a lot of people. Do you see this crowd around you pressing against you? And again, listen, you have to understand what we're meaning here by Jesus in the crowd. It's not like Jesus has a lot of room where he's maneuvering and like there's a crowd that's surrounding him, but still giving him a lot of space. No, they're crunching in around him. Okay. So there's a lot of people, whether intentionally or like just happen to be bumping into him because they're being bumped by other people or whatever, are touching Jesus, and they're touching his clothes and touching his garments. And you probably had people who were reaching out to touch his garments anyway, just so they could get the touch of a person who they thought was very amazing and things like that. Who knows? But the thing is, I mean, I wanted to cut the disciples some slack because sometimes the disciples are made fun of here. At least I hear that sometimes when people talk about this account and they talk about this passage. I'm like, well, their question is their answer to this is, who can blame them? Jesus turns around and all of a sudden he says, "Who touched my garments?" He says, you see the crowd pressing around you and you say, "Who touched me?" Yeah, and I think it's in one of the other accounts. I think it's in Luke's account. Jesus explains more, where he says, somebody touched my garments, I felt power go out of me. Verse 32 here in Mark chapter 5, it says, "And he looked around to see who had done it." Okay. Now here's the thing. You get a sense now that things have slowed down, if not stopped, and come to a screeching halt. As now Jesus is concerned about who touched his garments. Now I want to put myself in the sandals of Jairus, who, let's be honest, I mean, the woman who's bleeding for 12 years, yes, that's bad. I feel sorry for you that you've had to go through that. But you know what? My daughter is dying right now. She's on her last leg. And as the text said earlier, she's at the point of death, which gives you an understanding. We have no time to lose. So I don't know what Jairus is thinking. We don't get a sense of that. So I don't want to say that this is what Jairus is thinking because the text doesn't say. I can only imagine in my own mind what I would be thinking if I were Jairus and I'm at the point where like my daughter is at the point of death. And now Jesus is stopped because he's worried about who touched his garment. Wait a minute. Wait, what? Let's go. Let's keep going. My daughter is at the point of death. And you're worried about who touched my garment. And listen, when Jesus has stopped and is looking about, who touched the garments, we're now dealing with a situation where the miracle has already happened with this woman. The healing has happened. She's well. So now it's a matter of, okay, she's well. Okay, great. Congratulations, you're well. Can we proceed with my problem, with my daughter? Maybe it's noteworthy that Jairus doesn't speak up or say anything here. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to impose too much on the text here based on what is and isn't in the text. You got to be very careful of that. I'm just kind of thinking out loud. It's just kind of an interesting set of events that's going on here. And just given the situations that are going on, a man's little girl is dying and Jesus is looking around trying to find somebody who touched his garments because he felt power go out from him. And I'm sure that Jesus, knowing that if power gone out from him, that power isn't ineffective. When power's gone out from him, whatever that power touched it effectively so that whatever that person was suffering with was healed. So now that healing has taken place, why does it matter? Here's the thing. Jesus isn't totally ignorant about what's going on here. He knows that whoever touched his garments, that was their intention, and that was the chosen avenue by which that healing would take place, because that's the only option that they had. So Jesus is going to make a display of whoever's faith this is, which obviously we know is the woman, and as Jesus will learn, is the woman. And I think that this is something Jesus has had a way of doing this at a time or two in the Gospels, of making a display of somebody's faith. You kind of had that a little bit, somewhat so in our examination of the centurion. It was kind of as a semi-indictment against the Israelites, where he says, "I haven't found a faith like this even in Israel." He's saying, "Hey, check this out. Check out the faith of this guy." Kind of the same thing with the Canaanite woman that we looked at a few weeks ago. And I think here we're talking about the same thing. And here's the thing. The difference between Jairus and this woman is very noticeable. And I think one of the big things is that she is a woman, he is a man. Now, that might not mean much to us here today in the 21st century. But even setting aside the fact that Jairus is a VIP in everybody's minds, and that you would think that maybe he would get priority because of who he is, we're not only dealing with somebody who's maybe just an average person, but we're dealing with somebody who's a woman. And women weren't really given much time of day in the eyes of men in that culture. I mean, it stinks to say that, but that's just really how it was. And really, if you want to know about how radical and countercultural Jesus was in that day as he walked the earth, look at how he treated women back at that time, in that day. I can assure you that the way Jesus treated women during his time on earth was vastly different than how many other men in the Jewish community treated women at that time. His care, his love, and his respect for women in the first century in that time in that part of the world was absolutely amazing, given the culture of that time. And to make it a display and an example of great faith, and this coming from a woman, not a man, a woman, is truly something to behold as well. And again, in the 21st century, that sort of thing is lost on us. But in the time that this is going on, and even after this account is written by Mark himself, and you have first century readers who are reading this would have been something that's, well, I don't know, maybe not as shocking, maybe somewhat maybe somewhat shocking, maybe not as shocking. We are dealing with a Gentile audience here, although I think they would have understood, still had more understanding of how that worked in the Jewish world and everything like that, just based on things in their own culture. But either way that you're looking at it, it's lost on us in a lot of ways. And so I just think that that's really cool what Jesus is doing here with this woman. He's about to make a display of her great faith in front of everybody here. Now, the woman isn't one who wants this great amount of attention on her. You get that sense because it says, in verse 32, it says, and he looked around to see who had done it. And I think from the other accounts, and I think particularly it's from Luke, I think that the impression that you get is that he kept looking around and he kept inquiring, looking, hey, who touched me? Who touched me? Who touched me? And I think it's also in Luke. I keep making references to Luke, and I don't want to take the time to turn there. Just read the Lucan account for yourself. I believe it's in Luke chapter 8 somewhere. But what you see in, at least in that account, is that the woman saw that she wasn't able to hide herself. She wasn't able to keep herself hidden, which gives you this idea that she wasn't wanting to have attention drawn to herself, but Jesus was not letting the situation go. And so she finally comes forward. Now here in Mark, in verse 33, it says, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Now, originally, I mean, this has been a while ago, and just looking at this passage, I'd always really been under the impression that the reason why she was fearful and that she was trembling is because she was afraid that he would get mad at her for touching his garments and therefore making him ceremonially unclean. Because, you might think that the thought in her mind was, I can touch the edge of his garment to be healed, but, if I touch him, I'll make him ceremonially unclean. I've already made a lot of people around me unclean, but if there's one person that I don't want to make unclean, it's that guy. And so just a quick touch and kind of go by, kind of drift off in the distance, afraid to come forward when Jesus starts to ask who touched my clothes. You might think that she's fearful and trembling because if she admits that she's the one who did it, and then here's why, that Jesus will get mad and say, how dare you touch me when you're bleeding? You could have made me ceremonially unclean. But the more I thought about it, just before coming into this time and just studying the passage again, the more I don't think that that's really what's going on in her mind. That sort of thing really doesn't make a lot of sense, because if she has certainty that he has power within himself to heal if she touches touches his garment, and it works, and she touches the garment and she's made well. The power makes her well, but at the same time, it would make him ceremonially unclean. Does that sound right to you? It doesn't sound right to me. So I don't think that was a fear of hers, and really, I think that draws out all the more the certainty that she had in the healing that she would get if she, at the very least, could just touch his garment. If there was any doubt of this, of whether he could or couldn't do this, I would, and I can't get into her head. I'm not making any sort of dogmatic claims here. I would think that maybe she would lean more towards the thought of, you know what, this may work, it may not work. I'm not really sure. Therefore, I'm just going to keep my distance, because if this doesn't work, I've just made so many people around me unclean, and I made him unclean because I touched him. It didn't work. And now what does that say about me touching him? And he's now ceremonially unclean. I think that she comes to this knowing I can touch his garment, I will be made clean. And therefore, if that's her belief and she believes that to be true, then her worrying about him being ceremonially unclean by her touch is off the table. That doesn't even make any sense anymore, right? So I don't think that that's her worry. I don't think that that's her, why she's fearing and trembling and that sort of thing. If anything having to do with fear and trembling, as far as, afraid of Jesus perhaps being mad at her or something, maybe you could say she was afraid that he would get mad at her for going out into the crowd and touching other people, pushing through other people and making other people unclean just to get to her, and saying, you know what, miss, that was pretty rude and very selfish of you to make these people unclean and that sort of thing. I mean, if anything, maybe that was her fear. But I think more in line with what you have going on here is that it was maybe there was an element of emotional fear, but there was a reverential fear that we're talking about there. I mean, she just touched the Son of God. You realize that? Her, a regular somebody, a nobody compared to Jairus in the culture's eyes, and a woman. Maybe that was another thing. Who are you, woman, to touch me? A man, right? Maybe that was part of her fear too. I don't know. Maybe it's a combination of those things. I don't know. I mean, we can only speculate, but it says that she came in fear and trembling and fell down before him. So there's that prostration, just like we saw with Jairus when he pled with Jesus to come and heal his daughter. Here, this is after the fact of a healing, and it came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Verse 34, and he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." In other words, this is saying, be healed of your disease. I think that's saying, be healed of this disease and may that disease never come back, is what you're dealing with there. But I want you to draw your attention there to what the first word that he says there to her, daughter. If there was any fear that was overcoming her at that point, you would imagine how much that fear just melted off of her when he heard that word emanate from his lips. Daughter. I love that. Daughter, your faith has made you well. And this is happening in front of everybody. Everybody's seeing this. And so this is a display, and they're hearing the explanation because she told them the whole truth. So everybody is listening. The surrounding crowd, they're understanding what's going on here. And then Jesus, in front of them all, but directly to the woman, says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." What a wonderful man, Jesus. I mean, the God-man. I don't want to say that he's just a man, obviously, but you see the compassion. And again, just given what I just told you before, I mean, with her being a woman in that culture, this is something that's astounding, right? And not only that, because remember, I told you I want us also not only to focus on the faith of the woman, but on the character of Christ in all of this. Notice that he's no respecter of persons that, just regardless of anything. I mean, I think what you're dealing with here with Jairus and the woman, you are dealing with two people who have faith, but one is not above the other just because of their position. You have a synagogue ruler who's a somebody in everybody's eyes, and Jesus doesn't have problems meeting his need and healing his daughter, but he's not one who neglects somebody else because they don't hold that same position or maybe is not as important. I mean, again, in the eyes of culture, I want to add that in because I think in Jesus' eyes, they're all important. Who's not as important in the eyes of culture, and he deals with her just like he would deal with Jairus. I mean, just as far as meeting her need. And I think that that's amazing. And then one other thing that I think that we can draw from this is as far as what we see about Christ is that the extent of his power. What we've just seen here is a healing of a woman who had a bleeding problem in her body. And now she's well. Okay, great. And the situation with Jairus and Jairus' daughter started out with him saying that she's at the point of death. So at this point, she's still alive, but barely. I mean, she doesn't have much time. So you need to hurry up and get a move on, for this whole thing to work. Now, I do want to go a little bit beyond here, but just a little bit beyond, what our text is, because I think that this is important. Given what we've seen now with the woman and a display of her faith, we see, let me read verse 35 and 36. It says, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? So in their minds, the people who brought this report is like, once the condition reaches a certain point, that's it. There's nothing more that the teacher can do. So obviously these were people who didn't have an understanding that Jesus had power even over death. And they understood that Jesus could deal with this girl while she was still alive, but now that she's dead, it's too late. It says, you know what, don't bother him anymore. It's too late. And Jesus here, verse 36, it says, but overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. I think that this is interesting, that this is transpiring after what's happened with the woman. And that faith still goes into this whole thing. There was faith on her side. There's faith that still needs to be had. Well, I mean, not still needs to be had. I think that the synagogue ruler still has this. I think maybe this is Jesus' warning, saying, don't let your faith falter. Don't be afraid. Just believe. And Jesus is one who's saying, I can take care of this, no problem too. Believe that I can do this. Because you yourself know who you're dealing with, right? I mean, so if you have an understanding of who you're dealing with, there's no need to fear. All you need to do is just believe. Okay? And we're dealing with something that is, seemingly much bigger on the scale of amazing things that Jesus would do. I mean, he healed this woman with a bleeding problem. That is amazing. That is amazing. But, I mean, let's be honest. From our human minds, we line that up against raising somebody from the dead. You're like, oh, wow, right? But again, I mean, it's all amazing when it comes from the hand of God. I don't know if we should really say one is more or less amazing or anything like that. But I mean, even from the human mind, I mean, obviously from the people who brought this report, their whole mindset was once it reaches a certain point, Jesus can't do anything else. Don't bother the teacher anymore. She's died. She's dead. Too late. Game over. And Jesus, in the wake of everything that just happened with the woman, is saying the same faith is still at play here than as it was with that woman who just had the bleeding problem. I can do what I'm about to do with this daughter and raising her from the dead, just as I do with healing this woman's body and her bleeding problem. Raising somebody from the dead isn't anything. It's not like it's harder. It's more difficult. It's like, oh, this is going to be harder now. It would have been easier if I got there before she died. No. And in fact, when he arrives at the house and there are all the paid mourners that are there, he says, why are you wailing? She's not dead, but asleep. So the faith, I mean, and again, I don't think that this is dealing with we're saying anything where this isn't a faith that Jairus faltered in faith or anything like that. Again, he's just hearing the reports from other people. Jesus is overhearing that, and it's pretty much saying, don't let this falter your faith. Don't be afraid. She's dead, yes, but I mean, don't let that falter your faith. Just believe. And what a simple thing to say. Just believe. And sometimes I think that in our lives we need that simplicity sometimes. Just believe. Because sometimes we can overthink things to a very radical fault. And sometimes God might be calling us to, hey, don't just settle down, just believe. Okay? Don't get yourself in a tizzy, just believe. Okay? This wasn't anything that was impossible for the Lord. And we know from this account, and hopefully even with how we see God working in our lives, that nothing is impossible with God. Have you ever seen God do the seemingly impossible, at least from a human perspective? It's amazing, isn't it? Don't be afraid, just believe. So you have this whole thing. We've seen the tremendous faith of a woman who had an unstoppable faith, if you want to call it that. And then the compassion, the care, the love of a Savior extended to two people. One where it probably would have been expected culturally, and then the other where maybe not so much culturally. But Jesus treats them both with compassion and love, and is able to display his power, and is able to make much of their faith, especially the faith of the woman, more so, I would say. And as I said, Jairus' daughter, she ends up living, Jesus, says, get a little girl, rise up. And then he says, give her something to eat. And here you go. It wasn't a problem for Jesus. I think Jairus and this woman, their faith is truly amazing. So I hope that what we've seen today, what we saw and what we've seen in the last few weeks, just as we've hit on the theme of faith, has been very profitable for you, and that it's spoken to you. There was one thing I was going to do, I was thinking about doing, and maybe we'll continue on this theme for a couple of episodes next time we take a break from Revelation, where we'll continue on the theme of faith. Because there was a sermon that I preached earlier this year about faith, and it actually comes from the Old Testament. I was thinking maybe I would share that during this break, but and it's not the one that I shared with you earlier about the Canaanite woman. I'm talking about something else. But I thought maybe I'll save that for another time. So who knows? Maybe next go around from our break, I'll share that with you. I don't know. But I've enjoyed this examination of faith, looking at examples of faith in everything. I hope that it really speaks powerfully to you, because I know that faith is something that we can and just the word itself is something that we can just throw around. But do we really give thought as to what it is and what it really looks like and the things that go into that? Hopefully you've been able to see that in our examinations over the past few weeks. Okay, so we will leave it there. So next time we get together, we will be back in the book of Revelation. We're gonna get right at it and get busy with Revelation chapter 13. Like I said before, I'm not sure how many episodes we're gonna spend on chapter 13, but there are a lot of important things that we need to cover in chapter 13, and untangle some things that I think have been misunderstandings in Christian interpretation, or, and I'll just be bold to say this, just things that are just straight up wrong. People who said, oh, this means this, and they believe it to be this or that, and I'm one who says, no, absolutely 1,000% no. But something that's caught on with a lot of people throughout several years and decades and stuff. So we'll talk about all those things. We'll not talk about all those things next time. That's going to be a gradual thing. We'll work our way through that as we work through the chapter of Revelation chapter 13. So be sure to tune in for that when we get started on that. We will try and get down to the bottom of things as best as we can. in ways that are easy for us to understand. This isn't going to be anything that's going to be such a deep dive that it goes over all of our heads. So I just want to assure you of that. We'll look at this in an understandable way, and hopefully you'll be blessed by it. Okay, so we will leave things here for now. If you enjoy this show and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts, also on iHeartRadio, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow me, Steve Gill, on Twitter. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And one more reminder about my book, Signs of the End. What did Jesus say about his own return and the events that point to it? You can get that on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. Also available on Kindle as well. That is also an option. All right. Had a great time examining this portion of Scripture with you. I hope you enjoyed it as well. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time.